Now this video is a introduction to the indigenous cultures of Australia and some of the issues we're going to talk about. Now, I would hope that everything in this video should already be well known by any Australians amongst you. So if you grew up in Australia, went to school in Australia, hopefully you know all the stuff and so you don't need to watch this video. However, for people who've come from another country, like I did many years ago, this is important stuff to know and background for everything that follows. So, start off with terminology. By indigenous people or First Nations, we're talking about the people who lived in Australia before the Europeans arrived in 1788. Various names are used. There's Aboriginal Australians, Indigenous Australians and First Nation, and these are all more or less the same. The history is that the ancestors of the Aboriginal Australians arrived in Australia. We don't quite know when, but it's at least 65,000 years ago, and they've been here ever since. And the ones who arrived 65,000 years ago are the direct ancestors of the current indigenous people here, making it the oldest continuing culture that's been on the same land anywhere on the earth. Now, at the time when the British arrived in the late 18th century, they practiced a highly sophisticated hunter-gatherer life form. They were able to live extremely well on land that the Europeans regarded as a barely habitable desert. They almost certainly had a higher living standard than the average peasant back in England. They had amazing knowledge of the land, the plants, the animals, the skies and the seas, very rich and incredibly complicated oral culture. There are over 300 different Aboriginal languages, and you can't talk about one Aboriginal culture because the different groups in one part of Australia to another are quite different, far more different, say the British or the French, very different cultures, very different languages. So it's a hugely diverse culture. And then the Europeans, the British, arrived, and the British settlers by and large took the indigenous land. Vast numbers of indigenous people died, mostly because they caught European diseases such as smallpox, to which they had no immunity, but often they were actually deliberately murdered and massacred and shot when some European farmer wanted their land. The survivors were often just forced into mission settlements. These were often run by religious groups, and maybe the remaining people from a large number of indigenous groups were gathered together in a mission. The Yass mission was the main one near Canberra, where many of the people from here were rounded up and placed, where a lot of their culture was destroyed. Children were often separated from their parents with a deliberate desire to destroy the culture, and some were forced to work by British settlers who had taken their lands. Now today, 2024, when I'm recording this, roughly 3.3% of Australia's population identifies as Aboriginal. Here in the ACT it's about 2%, so about 1 in 50 people. Now most Indigenous people live in the cities, but about 25% live in remote areas. And many are seriously disadvantaged. The life expectancy of an Indigenous person in Australia is about 10 years less than the life expectancy of a non-Indigenous person such as me. They are 8 times more likely to be in prison, 7 times less likely to go to university. Their household income is on average 30% less than that for the non-Indigenous people in Australia. They have very high rates of suicide, domestic violence, smoking and drug use. What Indigenous people do have is a very strong and deep spiritual connection to country. In England, our spirit comes from churches or temples or synagogues or mosques or something like this. But for the Indigenous people, well, that often happens as well, but they get a strong connection to culture, to country, their ancestral lands. Not just any country, the lands of their ancestors. So these landscape sites, it might be a tree or a valley or a rocky outcrop, are their temples or their cathedrals of huge importance to them. And for the indigenous culture, they do not see themselves as separate from the land. They are part of the land, unlike the Western idea where there's us and there's the land is something that we can use to make our lives good. They don't see that separation so much. Indigenous people are on the front lines of climate change impact because their land is often being very severely affected by climate change, and they're also making enormous contributions to mitigation. So that's Australia, but of course Indigenous issues occur in many other parts of the world. The Native Americans in the USA and Canada, the Maori in New Zealand, indigenous people in South America, and across much of Asia. In more remote areas there are tribal people, often with a very distant or hostile relationship to the central government. So this is not just an Australian problem, though we will focus on Australia.